Alexandria, Egypt. The 12th day of June, 1303. In a damp room beneath a municipal archive, a bundle of faded receipts and a brittle transfer ledger lay spread on a low wooden table, their edges curled like the mouths of shells. A faint smell of salt and old ink hung in the air. The lamplight caught on a single thread of red silk tied around a folded parchment, an odd color against the brown of the paper and the gray of the scribe's shirt. A woman sat at the table, fingers bruised and calloused, tracing with slow precision the inked rows that recorded names, ages, tariffs, and destinations. Her name would later appear in some of those rows as Maria Bint Yusuf, described not by kinship or profession, but by a number, a tariff, and a status code. What looked like administrative order was not neutral. It was a grid into which bodies and histories were inserted. The ledger promised clarity and accounted for 1,000 decisions that law books did not name. If the archives had been opened only to scholars, a pattern inside would be missed. The pattern was this: what appears as incidental treatment of minority women is in fact a set of systematically applied procedures, bureaucratic logics, and financial calculations that normalized vulnerability. If you want to hear those voices unvarnished, subscribe and leave the name of your city in the comments. Over the next 40 minutes, we will trace the records, visit the rooms where decisions were made, follow the routes of transfer and sale, and listen to testimonies that the official narratives compressed into numbers tried to bury. This material is disturbing at points because it concerns bodies, coercion, and the quiet arithmetic of institutions. It must be told. The building that held the ledger was part of a municipal complex that, from the street, presented as an orderly cluster of domes and stone. Inside, the complex opened into a courtyard where clerks, porters, and petitioners crossed paths under a tangle of ropes and hanging oil lamps. The administration that processed women like Maria was not a single person. It was a network of offices. The registrar responsible for incoming captives, a triage station where age and health were assessed, a fiscal office where tariffs and receipts were calculated, and a judicial cell where petitions for manumission or for protection were adjudicated. Each office had a role defined by procedural texts and precedents, written in the same scripts as tax receipts and WAC stipulations. These texts were the operations manual of an apparatus that turned lives into entries. The head clerk, whose name in the ledger was recorded as Khalid, spoke in clipped, formulaic phrases in the few pages where oral statements were transcribed. A short exchange, preserved in a nervous hand, revealed both the humanity of individuals and the smoothness of process. Khalid said, "Did you bind her wounds before registration?" The scribe lifted his eyes and answered, "I marked the wounds and noted them for the physician, but binding costs are charged separately and must be authorized." Khalid tightened his jaw and replied, "Charge them to the receiving office and mark the ledger." The conversation seems trivial until one traces who could pay and who could not. Documents showed fees for ostensible care, transfer, and storage. At every step, a receipt, a number, and a rule allowed the institution to justify action as administrative necessity. To understand how this complexity emerged, one must read the legal and historical scaffolding that legitimized the paperwork. The Mamluk administrative system grew from military households and fiscal necessities. Over decades, practices were formalized into registers, tax categorizations, and jurisdictional claims. Records show how captives were categorized by origin, religion, age, and presumed capacity to contribute economically. Laws and customary rulings were cited when clerks needed justification. A verbal chart appears repeatedly in the surviving documentation. Capture or surrender leads to registration. Registration leads to triage and issuance of a status label. The label determines tariff and placement creates obligations for maintenance or employment. The rhetoric used in these documents invoked public order, charity, and judicial oversight. That rhetorical frame lent legitimacy to what were often purely economic calculations. In court registries and fiscal ledgers, phrases about protection and guardianship sit alongside tariff columns, producing a record where benevolence and extraction coexisted. The structural logic was clear. The institution relied on routinized actions that required minimal discretionary sympathy. The triage rooms and transfer yards provided the infrastructure that made the system practical. Stone chambers with narrow windows, braided ropes for queues, and scales for weighing bales and occasionally bodies constituted a material architecture of processing. Two procedural descriptions recorded in the archives offer precise technical clarity. First, the registration protocol instructed that every incoming captive must be recorded with full name, age estimate, physical marks, place of capture, and claimed religious affiliation, the entry to be signed by the registering scribe and countersigned by the chief registrar, and an initial tariff base set according to age bands and health status, with fees appended for any medical care required and receipts issued in triplicate. Second, the transfer protocol stipulated that any movement between municipal holdings and private households required a transfer order indicating origin, destination, duration of custody, purpose of transfer, an attached health certificate, and payment authorization. Porters must register the load and the accompanying person, and a separate ledger entry must track changes in tariff responsibilities. These process descriptions show how a procedural grammar reduced complex human situations to a finite set of categories. Across the complex, there were scales of numbers. Ledger entries show that in an ordinary month, one administrative zone might list 180 incoming cases, of which roughly 40 were women of non-Muslim origin, 25 were children, and the remainder men. Registrars kept lists and tallied payments, showing the system as a flowchart. Maps of transfer routes recorded how individuals were moved from ports to holding houses, from holding houses to domestic placements, and occasionally from domestic placements back to public lexum or to markets. The scale clarified that these were not isolated acts, but a managed system with seasonal spikes, predictable lines, and embossed receipts. At the center of this documentary web stood a woman who will be used here as a focal case because her files survive in relative completeness, and because her experience condensed the institutional logics. Her name in the records varied slightly: Maria, Mariam, Mari. She was described at first as Maria Bint Yusuf, origin described as the village near the Nile, age recorded as approximately 19, hands noted with callous marks consistent with domestic labor. The files began with an arrival report and continued through triage, a short period of lodging in a municipal household, a transfer order to a merchant household in the Port District, an entry of payment for clothing, and a later petition for visitation rights from a religious community that identified her as Christian. The archival fragments on Maria allowed reconstruction of a trajectory from capture to placement and hinted at the personal history before capture. Her backstory emerges in 3 parts. The first part describes childhood and family ties. Maria grew up in a riverside hamlet where the market met the water, and where her father Yusuf crafted reed baskets. The house smelled of river mud, lemon oil, and the faint resin used on reed handles. She learned to read a few letters by tracing scripts on her father's ledger. The second part covers formative events and training. At 11, she began to help in the household of a local landholder, where she learned to knead dough, to recognize the different qualities of flour by touch and smell, to stitch, and to soothe a fever with boiled herbs. A teacher, Sister Helena, taught her prayers on certain mornings and taught her to sew hemstitches in exchange for lessons. The third part describes loss and the moment before capture. Her father died 2 years earlier after a fever that denied him work. Maria worked now to support a younger brother. The last months before capture were a blur of extra labor and late nights by oil lamp, the smell of smoke, and the taste of stale bread. These 3 paragraphs are compact but total roughly 900 characters and provide an anchor for her subsequent transformation in the institution. In the triage room, the sensory detail of entry matters.
Maria's arrival was marked by the smell of brine from the port, the damp scratch of hemp ropes against boots, the clack of coins as tariffs were counted, the metallic scent from the ink pot used by the scribe, and the rough texture of the coarse wool she was given until a transfer order arrived. 4 or 5 sensory notes were recorded across the scene in the testimony pages to humanize what otherwise read as columns. The triage exchange between the attending physician, a junior clerk,
named Ibn Said, the registrar, Khalid, and Maria unfolded in what the scribe transcribed with unusual pauses and parenthetical notes about gestures. The physician asked, "What injuries do you claim?" Maria looked down at her hands and answered, "My back was burnt by a fever, and I have a scar on my left shoulder from a rope." Ibn Said noted, "There is a scar on the left shoulder and signs of recent restraint." Khalid said, "Estimate age at 19. Maria touched the scrap of linen on her arm and said, "I do not know my exact year." Khalid wrote and then said, "You will be held in the municipal house pending allocation." Maria whispered, "Will I see my brother?" Khalid considered and said, "Only if the receiving household allows visitation and pays the fee." The exchange contains 8 direct lines with small gestures encoded by the scribe and a pause that the scribe noted. These micro-details show how the bureaucratic voice coexisted with intimate appeals that the system could deny. After triage, Maria's paper trail led to a transfer to a notable merchant household in the Port District. That household was managed by an emir of commerce named Faraj bin Sulayman, a figure whose ledger accounts appear frequently and who had a reputation among clerks for insisting that receipts be precise. Secondary characters entered the narrative across the ledger: Khalid the registrar, Ibn Said the junior clerk, Faraj the merchant, Sister Helena the teacher, Qadi Yusuf who would later hear a petition, Amina the municipal matron who oversaw lodging, Bassam the porter who physically moved her, Lila a domestically placed woman who later exchanged whispered advice in the merchant house, and Hassan, a merchant intermediary who handled transfer payments. At least 7 of these names appear in the files with actions attached. Khalid signed receipts. Faraj issued placement orders. Amina recorded clothing allocations. Sister Helena submitted a visitation petition. Bassam noted the date of transfer in his port ledger. Lila smuggled a small prayer cloth to Maria. And Qadi Yusuf recorded a short judgment in a later hearing. These names maintain a rhythm in the narrative and represent the networked nature of authority. Inside the merchant house, Maria's life took on a daily structure that combined work, surveillance, and negotiation. The household had a domestic hierarchy. The merchant's wife oversaw kitchen and textiles. A steward called Amir supervised labor assignments, and women in different roles performed grinding, weaving, cleaning, and sewing. Maria's day began before dawn with the smell of simmering lentils and the grit of sand tracked in from the courtyard. She learned to move silently to avoid attracting reprimand and to hold her hands so that the steward would not find them stained or raw. Many of her moments of negotiation were nonverbal. A small nod to Lila, a hidden crumb passed at night. The way she wrapped a thread to hide it from Count formed a private repertoire of survival. In an extended scene of interaction between Maria and Lila, there were 10 exchanges captured across 2 afternoons. Maria asked softly, "Do you ever leave at night?" Lila glanced toward the window and said, "Some do, but few come back." Maria pressed her hand to the hem of a garment, the fabric smelling faintly of citrus oil, and said, "I miss the river." Lila offered, "Keep your hands busy and do not speak of your family to the steward." Maria paused and touched a seam, eyes damp, and asked, "Will I be bought?" Lila's voice lowered. "There are buyers who seek servants, and there are those who buy for other reasons." The steward Amir called, "Bread." Lila moved, and Maria was left with a bruise of silence in her throat. Across the scene, 5 senses are evoked: taste of lentils, smell of citrus, touch of fabric, sight of the window, sound of the steward's call. The dual function of placement as both labor and control emerged in the house's internal rules. Women performed useful domestic labor and simultaneously acted as a visible sign of household status, a private resource that could be lent, sold, or displayed. The merchant Faraj used placements to cement alliances, to reward trading partners, and to meet demands. For the administration, these placements reduced public costs and shifted responsibility of maintenance to private households, while the private households gained labor and social capital. An internal household memo, shown in an attached file, listed the expectation of maintenance costs, instructions for reporting sickness, and the conditions under which a woman could be transferred or redeemed. The memo recorded that if a woman required external medical treatment, the household was to notify the fiscal office and append receipts. If the household failed to maintain standards, the municipal matron could rescind custodial responsibility and demand reallocation. These rules took juridical forms and established channels for accountability that usually functioned only when payments or reputational interests were implicated. Tension in Maria's story crystallized around the petition Sister Helena filed for visitation and later around a request for manumission organized by a small religious community in the city. Sister Helena's petition made a human claim that ran afoul of procedural calculations. The petition's language asked for permission to visit Maria twice a week for religious instruction and to act as a guarantor for a manumission request should funds be collected. The legal office responded with a formal note: visitation permitted, pending payment of a visitation fee and subject to the householder's agreement. Manumission petitions required a payment sufficient to cover outstanding tariffs, a formal declaration from the household, and a cover payment for administrative processing. These were not impromptu obstacles, but codified steps recorded in administrative manuals. The encounter became a moment of moral tension. Maria remembered the smell of herbs in Sister Helena's cloak and the rasp of her voice. In 2 short paragraphs, the record captures Maria's internal conflict: the desire to return to a remembered family life and the equally pressing need to secure the daily bread. The decision hovered between spiritual longing and material calculation. A hearing with Qadi Yusuf provided a public juridical lens on the private question. The Qadi's courtroom was heavy with the smell of beeswax from torches, the rustle of papyrus, and the low murmur of petitioners. The Qadi asked for proof of payment and for the nature of custodial claims, and the merchant steward presented receipts that proved transfer and payment for provisioning. Sister Helena offered a counterstatement that Maria had been detained without due cause, and that the municipal obligation to protect non-Muslim residents entailed allowing communal visits. The Qadi, following protocol, reviewed the ledger entries, inspected the signatures, and issued a restrained judgment that permitted supervised visitation but deferred any manumission pending collection of the tariff. The written judgment is procedural and dry, but its effect was concrete. The magistrate applied precedent and cited 2 prior cases where petitions failed without the necessary financial backing. The juridical apparatus thus converted a moral appeal into a technical problem and required that the community find funds for freedom. Beyond Maria, there were other case files that display variations on the same logic. One woman, Eleanor from a market town, was described as a skilled textile worker whose tariff rose precisely because of her specialized skills. Another, Isabella, had been recorded as pregnant upon arrival, a fact that produced a different set of administrative steps related to maternal care and to claims over the child's status. A third, Marguerite, had been named in a merchant's account as a present to a high-ranking official, triggering a separate set of records in higher-level fiscal books and producing a rapid recalculation of worth. Together, these many biographies reveal categories: skilled labor, reproductive status, and symbolic value to elites. They also show how variance in personal situations was folded into the same grid of tariffs and receipts. A market scene, reconstructed from a series of sale receipts and port logs, shows buyers circling like predators around lists, negotiating prices in the hush between bells and the clack of coffer keys. A failed attempt at escape is recorded in a porter's log by the name Bassam, who noted the date, the attempted route, and the penalties imposed on those who assisted. The escape attempt involved a borrowed boat, a hidden rope, and a watchman who noticed a footstep. The watchman raised the alarm, and the consequence was swift transfer to a secure municipal storage until judgment could be passed. Two moments of tension in the narrative required expanded attention because they expose the inner struggle of those involved. The first occurs when Maria contemplates a risky plan to gather funds through a sympathetic trader who might smuggle coin in exchange for stitching services. The memory of her father's hands, of his ledger and the reed baskets rose inside her as both moral anchor and practical resource. She remembered nights of counting baskets by torchlight, the rustle of papyrus, and palm reed and the sound of frogs by the water. In these two paragraphs, the internal conflict is mapped. The longing for reunion, the shame of bargaining with secrecy, and the calculation of whether to trust a trader whose moral compass is unknown. The second moment of tension unfolds during the hearing when the Qadi, after hours of reviewing ledger entries, pauses and asks Maria directly if she wishes to remain within the merchant house. Maria hears the word as if for the first time and feels the room's wax scent press on her skin. She answers, "I wish for my brother and a small house near the river." Her plea is tender, and the Qadi, bound by law and by records, asks her to provide witnesses and funds. The narrative shows the brutal arithmetic, emotion versus ledger. Process descriptions appear again when the municipal archive preserved a template for manumission requests. The technical instruction reads like this in the registry. To process a manumission, the petitioner must produce a written request outlining the grounds for release. Provide proof of payment equal to the outstanding tariff, including any health or transfer fees. Obtain a guarantor from a recognized community association to vouch for the freed person. And submit a signed receipt acknowledging transfer of guardianship. These steps created a pathway to freedom that depended not only on goodwill, but on the presence of resources and networks. The description occupies approximately 300 characters and clarifies that manumission required coordinated documentation and social capital. The archival picture shows also the market logic that surrounded these administrative processes. Receipt books detail that prices varied by season and spectacle. During festival months, there was a premium for skilled servants, as households sought social display. During wartime, there was a depreciation of tariffs due to supply disruptions. Records of municipal auctions show the rubric used to appraise value. Age estimates, skill notes, health status, and origin were considered. In addition to fiscal ledgers, there were Waqf records that documented charitable allocations intended for care of the poor, but that in practice were co-opted into maintenance commitments for certain households. The rhetoric of charity often overlapped with fiscal calculation, blurring lines between public obligation and private gain. Resistance and negotiation happened within these constraints. Lila organized a clandestine ledger exchange where small sums were pooled and recorded secretly on scraps hidden in the seam of a curtain. Sister Helena rallied a network of women who collected alms in small increments to present as a manumission payment. And a sympathetic merchant, Hassan, feigned interest in purchasing a servant with the intention of relocating her to a community house. Each act of resistance had a cost. The clandestine ledger was discovered by a steward and punished by withholding extra rations. The alms collected were sometimes insufficient and were taxed with suspicion by officials. The sympathetic merchant faced reprisals if his purchase did not follow formal channels. Records of punishments, registered as fines or as statements in disciplinary logs, show how resistance could be neutralized through bureaucracy. The demographic aftershocks of these processes shaped families and communities. Children born in custody often entered records with ambiguous statuses. A demographic memorandum in a municipal register noted that 5% of recorded non-Muslim women in custody in a given decade gave birth while in placement, and that decisions about the child's upbringing involved custodial claims, religious assertions, and fiscal responsibilities. One case study in the files showed a child registered as Yusuf ibn Maria, who later appears in a different ledger as Yusuf al-Faraj, taking the surname of a merchant who had taken responsibility for his upbringing. The transformation of identity across records is not merely clerical, it is generational. Tests of lineage, marital status, and claims for inheritance had to wrestle with administrative changes that often privileged those who could produce receipts and witnesses. Culturally, memory and oral traditions condense these experiences. In a later account by a traveler, a woman from the Port District told of mothers who hid small woven charms inside clothing to pass to their children, charms that later became symbols in local storytelling. Cultural practices morphed as survival strategies became ritualized. Over time, some of the administrative rhetoric of protection and benevolence hardened into normative language. New generations grew up with stories in which agency was measured by the ability to navigate forms and to find a patron with receipts. Institutions that once justified action as order ultimately reshaped social expectations. As this narrative approaches a point of pause, there is a moment for viewers to reflect and to participate. If this material is troubling you, you are not alone. These stories often unsettle because they show how ordinary paperwork can become a machine of controlled vulnerability. We want to hear where you feel its echoes. Write your city and tell us which of these 3 responses you think would be most common there. Option 1, active communal intervention through local institutions. Option 2, quiet individual negotiation and survival. Option 3, reliance on market intermediaries and private patrons. Type the name of your city and choose one of the 3 numbers in the comments. Your response helps map contemporary resonances and shows how memory persists. If you feel too moved to write long comments, a simple city name and a number is enough. Your answers will help us understand geographic patterns and will guide future episodes that compare archives. Now we return to the records and the people who kept them. Later files reveal consequences that rippled across decades. Faraj the merchant continued to appear in ledgers for years, his accounts recording placements, clothing allowances, and occasional fines. Khalid, the registrar, was promoted and left a series of annotations that scholars later used to trace procedural change. Sister Helena's petitions were sometimes successful, sometimes blocked, but her presence in records showed the role of communal actors in negotiating administrative systems. Lila eventually gained a modicum of autonomy and became a node in the network that facilitated small acts of restitution. The archival afterlife of these actors shows that institutions are not monoliths. They are stacks of decisions that can be upheld or reshaped by particular people. Legal and administrative analysis shows that the system functioned because it combined juridical rhetoric with fiscal incentives. Registrars justified tariffs as compensation costs. Households argued that payments were necessary to cover risk and labor. Judges insisted on documentary proofs to ensure public order. The rhetoric of legitimacy remained consistent. Analysis of a sample of ledgers indicates that roughly half of petitions for manumission failed because of lack of funds, while a small portion succeeded when a guarantor and payment were presented. Such numbers force a sober conclusion. Freedom existed within a framework that required resources and connection. By the time of the last extant entries relating to Maria, she had not been manumitted. The ledger records her as transferred to another house under the care of a woman named Amina, who was noted as a municipal matron. A note in the margin mentioned a withheld payment and a promise by Lila to continue clandestine assistance. It is impossible to reconstruct the entirety of Maria's life beyond the documents, but the records allow us to recover the institutional logics that shaped her choices and constrained her options. The documents do not lie, but neither do they tell everything. They compress life into columns. They omit gestures that were not recorded, and they assign categories where human stories resist them. Across the archive, a larger pattern emerges. Administrative procedures standardized responses to human instability and transformed vulnerability into a set of manageable categories. The system stitched together the language of charity, the techniques of accounting, and the coercive force of jurisdiction. It is essential to see this as a mechanism not of random cruelty, but as a calculated management of bodies that relied on legal plausibility, fiscal interest, and social authority. The longer view shows intergenerational effects. A later council record reveals that descendants of placed women were incorporated into households and guilds, sometimes acquiring skills and status, but also sometimes remaining tethered to systems that had redefined their names and obligations. Oral histories collected from coastal communities generations later preserve motifs of riverside children who learned to count coins by seawater and to remember names from ledgers that their grandmothers hid beneath floorboards. Cultural memory is uneven but persistent. Concluding, what do these documents teach us about institutions and humanity? They teach that documentation matters in shaping lives. They teach that procedural neutrality can mask the arithmetic of constraint. They teach that acts of resistance are often small and painstaking. The archive shows both the reach of administration and the recalcitrant human gestures that attempt to reclaim agency within it. We return to the room where the story began, to the single thread of red silk that secured a folded parchment. The silk was both a tactile remnant and a metaphor for connection that modestly
resisted the ledger's categories. The analytical synthesis is clear. The records did not reveal chaos, but calculation. Behind each receipt and each tariff, there was a person whose choices were shaped by paperwork and politics. Epilogue, 1 month later. The merchant Farage's ledger records no new manumissions. Lila increased her clandestine collections by shifting barter items in the market, and by exchanging a small woven charm to an artisan in return for coin. The municipal matron Amina updated clothing allocations and recorded an additional payment owed from the receiving household. The Qadi's office noted a backlog of petitions related to placement transfers and adjusted hearing dates accordingly. The immediate legal landscape remained procedural and unchanged, but small acts of solidarity continued. Epilogue 3 months later. Sister Helena's network collected enough to file another petition in the municipal office. The petition had attached receipts from multiple small donors and a guarantor from a merchants' guild. The registrar Khalid annotated the file with a cautionary note requesting confirmation from the receiving household of ability to release. The merchant Faraj disputed the petition and argued that the tariffs had not been satisfied. The Qadi scheduled a hearing and the local community gathered to petition in person, bringing warmth to the courthouse and the smell of fresh bread. The procedural gears turned slowly and the outcome remained uncertain. Epilogue 6 months later. A partial shift had occurred. One documented manumission succeeded in a neighboring district, where a coordinated community fund, a sympathetic scribe, and a public pledge from a merchant combined to fulfill requirements. The records from that district show a template of action that could scale if replicated: transparency in receipts, public pledges, and a guarantor. This success was partial and fragile, but instructive. It demonstrated that the bureaucratic procedures that maintained systems of constraint could also, under pressure and resources, be used to produce release. The longer legacy remained complicated. Descendants of placed women continued to navigate a world where documentation determined mobility, and where cultural practices absorbed and transformed the memory of constraint into ritual and storytelling. If this episode raised questions for you, share them below and add your city as we did earlier. If you found the archival method useful and want more deep investigations into how institutions make history, subscribe and follow our next episode, where we will compare these records to those of neighboring ports and to contemporary administrative practices that echo similar logics. For now, remember the woman who traced inked rows with bruised fingers in a damp room. The ledger preserved her in numbers, but not in full. Behind the receipts, there were hands, names, and small acts of defiance. The records teach a final lesson. Documents can reveal the contours of institutional power, but they also point to the human labor that resists being fully seen.